This is the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast, a place to learn about U.S. military history as told through the stories of service members, military units, and supporting civilians. Join us as we work to preserve their memories for future generations. Welcome, everyone, to the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Gabriel Suarez. It's been a long time since our last episode. Glad to be back from the long summer break. So just want to remind everyone, we have a great number of episodes lined up for you in the next couple of weeks. So if you don't want to miss an episode, go ahead and hit subscribe on your favorite podcast player, and it'll download whenever we release them. Our guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Richard Anderson, or Rick Anderson. Rick is a professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. During his active duty time, he's spent time as an aviation officer in various locations, including with the 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne Division. He spent time as an aide-de-camp to the commanding general at the Army Aviation Center of Excellence, and he's also been a prior instructor at West Point teaching history. Mid-career, he changed to a functional area 59, which serving time as a strategic planner with the 2nd ID in Korea and at U.S. Army South in the FUOP section. He's currently in his 2nd stint at the Department of History at U.S. Military Academy, and I am glad to have him on to discuss his specialty, which is the United States Army Special Observer Group from World War II. Rick, welcome. Glad to have you on.
All right, thanks. I appreciate you having me. So, hey, can I do my disclaimer?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So before I start talking about my research, I do need to say that the views expressed on this podcast are from my own research. As an academic, they do not represent the views of the United States Military Academy, nor do they represent the views of the Department of Defense.
All right. So how's it been? It's been a while.
Yep, it's been a bit. Remember working with you in San Antonio. It's been great to be able to catch up with you on this program. I appreciate you inviting me to talk.
Yeah. So have you guys started the academic year yet, or the cadets all kind of just finishing up their summer camp stuff and then getting ready to start?
Yeah. So we're in our 2nd week of classes, so we're still getting into the groove of things. But it's been fun teaching the first few lessons.
Okay, that's awesome. To prepare, I did the unthinkable. I actually read your entire dissertation, all 400 plus pages of it.
So besides my committee, you're probably the only person to do that.
So I recommend everyone, by the time you finish listening to this episode, you'll want to learn more about the U.S. Special Observer Group. So we'll put the link to in the podcast notes to where you guys can find it and download for free. The only thing I was sad about when I finished it is I don't get to claim it for my Goodreads annual list. So I'm kind of behind on my reading challenge this year. So I don't get to claim it. So I think in my heart I will claim it, though. So I guess first off, I mean, it's something new to me for how much I enjoy history and studied World War II. I've never heard of this. So I guess right off the bat, what was the U.S. Army Special Observer Group?
Well, Gabe, the U.S. Army Special Observer Group was a small group of U.S. Army officers who traveled to the United Kingdom in May 1941. Now, I want to emphasize that this is 7 months prior to Pearl Harbor. Okay, so they traveled to the UK to develop war plans with the British. It consisted of a small staff of 16 officers that included a chief of staff, a general staff of 5 officers, and a special staff with representatives from the Ordnance Department, the Corps of Engineers, the Quartermaster Corps, the Medical Corps, the Signal Corps, and the Air Corps. They also had a small staff of enlisted clerks to help them with office work. This group was headed by an Air Corps officer named Major General James E. Cheney.
Can you, I guess, frame the situation in for World War II, kind of what the situation it was in Europe that facilitated the need to send this group over?
So at the point that the group went over to the United Kingdom, most of Western Europe, to include France, had fallen to Germany. The British Empire was the sole major power fighting against the Third Reich. And this situation prompted officials in the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy to begin considering options regarding U.S. strategic policy. After extensive analysis, they determined that British survival was essential for U.S. security and that they needed to meet with the British to develop a common strategy. So U.S. and British military officials developed this common strategy in a series of secret meetings in Washington, D.C. from January to March 1941. These meetings were called the American-British Conversations. As the United States was still neutral at the time these meetings occurred, the U.S. representatives in the meetings made no formal or binding agreements. Instead, the plans they developed during the conferences were meant to be contingencies, to be executed only in the event that the U.S. entered the war. The conferees agreed that among the Axis powers, Germany was the primary threat. And reflecting this assumption, the broad strategy that the participants formulated called for both countries to conduct defensive operations against Germany first and maintain a defensive posture against Japan in the Pacific. The participants drew up the results of their deliberations in a conference report entitled ABC-1. ABC stands for American-British Conversations, by the way. So they met this report to serve as a guide for further collaborative planning. To facilitate this planning, the two countries agreed to exchange missions composed of representatives from the military services of each nation. The Special Observer Group was the Army portion of the mission that the U.S. sent to Britain. There was also a Navy group that served under an officer called the Special Naval Observer. But my research principally concerned the activities of the Army group. SPOB's primary mission was to negotiate with the British Chiefs of Staff and conduct detailed planning with the British to fulfill the requirements of ABC-1 and a joint Army-Navy war plan called Rainbow 5 that had been in development prior to the conference and was adjusted to meet the requirements of the agreements that took place during the American-British Conversations.
Yeah, that was, like I said, that was definitely something I learned. I never knew that this group even existed. In your research, I you talk about how this group was chosen. Can you talk a little bit about who chose them, who gave them the mission, and maybe a little bit of background of some of the key members of the initial group?
So the group's members were technically chosen by the War Department G1 office. For those of you that aren't familiar with the divisions of a general staff, G1 is the personnel office. So they're, one of their responsibilities is to manage assignments for the Army. So after the American-British Conversations, the G1 office was given the task of finding officers that were appropriate for this type of work. I don't think we really have time for me to go through the bio of every officer that was in the group, but I've highlighted a few that were particularly significant in the group's activities. So I'll start with the head of mission, Major General James E. Cheney. He was selected to be the head of the U.S. Army Special Observer Group, as I said before, and he's a Air Corps general. And one of the reasons that he was selected was that he had observed British air operations during the Battle of Britain. So, as the Luftwaffe is attacking the United Kingdom, the U.S. Army saw this, even though they weren't involved and they weren't planning on getting involved at this point. They saw the air attack on Britain as an opportunity to observe the latest developments in warfare. So the idea was that you send people over to observe how the Germans are attacking and how the British are defending themselves, and then to try to learn from what's going on. So Cheney was one of those observers. So he went over, he observed those operations, he became familiar with the British system of air defense, and then he drafted a report, which he subsequently sent back to the War Department. And then, because of this, he was subsequently designated as head of the U.S. Air Defense Command. All right. So he was responsible. This command was responsible for developing a system to defend the United States from air attack. So taking what he learned from the United Kingdom, he and his staff conducted a series of experiments where they simulated attacks on the United States. And then they set up a system of radar and observers. Not as robust as the British system, but with what they had available, and began developing a system of air defense for the United States.
Simulation is my favorite thing.
Yes. And then, prior to that, he had served in various positions in the Air Service and the Air Corps. Another thing that made him attractive as the head of this mission was that he had spent time serving as an assistant military attaché in Rome. So he had experience interacting with, foreign governments. Yeah.
Got it.
Yep. So his chief of staff was a guy named Colonel Joseph T. McNerney. He was also an Air Corps officer. The primary reason he was selected was because he participated in the American-British conversation. So he knew the ABC-1 document very well.
And then just kind of the background of how they got from A to B,
Yep.
I guess.
Yep. So he already had experience negotiating with the British during the conference. So, he was aware of what their concerns were. He had also served as the head of the Joint Planning Committee of the War Department in the War Department General Staff's War Plans Division. So he was familiar with most of the war plans that the United States had at the time, which also made him attractive as a chief of staff. You have Lieutenant Colonel Charles L. Bolte. He was the SPOB's plans officer. And then after McNerney was recalled to the United States around December, Bolte was elevated to serve as Cheney's chief of staff. And he remained the chief of staff until the group essentially changed to European Theater of Operations United States Army, or ETUSA for short. It's kind of a hard one to say. Yep. So he was an infantry officer. He had entered service in the Plattsburgh camps, which were it was this readiness movement that was taking place in the United States around the time that the First World War broke out. He ended up serving in the First World War with the 4th Infantry Division, where he was wounded in action. He also served as an instructor in the infantry school under George C. Marshall. So Marshall knew him well. And Marshall reviewed the list of officers in this group, by the way.
Yeah, against his alleged little black book he always kept.
Yep. And then Bolte had also seen service with the 15th Infantry Regiment in China.
Okay.
Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Dahlquist, he was the SPOB's G1, their personnel officer. He was an infantry officer, and he had actually been serving in the War Department General Staff G1 office at the time the group was formed, which is probably why he was selected for that post. And then the last guy I want to highlight is Colonel Alfred J. Lyon, who was the SPOB's air officer. So he was the one that was, air planning was a major component in the group's planning work, and he was responsible for overseeing that portion of the planning. And he was also an Air Corps officer, of course, and he had a long history of being involved in aircraft research and procurement. And while serving in these posts, he earned a master's of engineering from MIT. Very, very smart guy.
So when they got there to England or the United Kingdom, how was their initial integration when they introduced themselves and got to know the British establishment after their arrival? Highlight any of their initial successes or challenges of those first couple of weeks.
Yep. So the main challenge that confronted them initially was learning about how the British organized themselves, as well as determining the best way to interact with their British counterparts. Fortunately for them, the British at that time had a fairly mature committee system by which its various services and departments cooperated. So in terms of integrating with the British, the SPOB staff would either form a new committee with the British to consider, some type of problem that had arisen, or more commonly, they would just fall in on an existing British committee.
Okay. Or
they would meet directly with the office that was responsible for the particular resources that they were trying to coordinate for their planning efforts. So interacting with the British, just because of the system, it was fairly easy for them, I would say. And the British were very motivated to sort of get, the Americans on board.
Yeah.
So they opened, themselves up to these observers. And I really didn't see much evidence of obstruction on the part of the British, except, there were disagreements at time, but, there wasn't a lot of withholding of information that I could see on the British part.
Remind me again when they arrived.
So they arrived in May of 1941.
Okay, so soon after they arrived, can you kind of go over their first major planning activity in regards to the Iceland relief?
Yep. So again, remind everybody, ABC 1 is sort of the general document that outlines, the broad strategy and, generally how the British and the Americans are going to cooperate in the event the U.S. enters the war on the side of the British. And then Rainbow 5 is the joint Army Navy plan for executing ABC 1.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tasks in Rainbow 5 is for the U.S. Army to relieve as soon as practicable the British garrison in Iceland. So the idea is that once war breaks out, or not once war breaks out, but once the United States enters the war, then they send some of their forces to Iceland. This will free up British forces for operations elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple weeks after the special observers get to England, President Franklin D. Roosevelt directed the U.S. Army and Navy to relieve British forces in Ireland basically as soon as practical, from that point, instead of waiting until U.S. entry into the war.
Yeah.
Through a creative interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, he declared in the spring of 1941 that Iceland fell within the Western Hemisphere. Now, if you look at him,
I was kind of wondering when I was reading that how that wasn't considered the U.S. joining the war effort if they were sending troops to Iceland.
Well, it's 1941 is kind of an interesting period because the U.S. is taking these increasingly provocative actions against Germany in the Atlantic,
mm-hmm.
right? So there's a designation of Iceland as being in the Western Hemisphere. U.S. ships begin calling in the positions of German craft to British ships, right? They're providing them information on their locations,
mm-hmm.
To the point that to shake them, because they're tailing them, Germans start firing at them on the high seas. So prior to Pearl Harbor, by September, the German Navy and the U.S. Navy are taking pot shots at each other. So there's this environment of increasingly provocative actions.
Mm-hmm.
But Germany is too canny, to declare war at that point because it's not in their interest to bring the U.S. into the war.
They totally didn't take the bait.
Yep. So Roosevelt just declares that Iceland falls within the Western Hemisphere, and under the Monroe Doctrine, that puts it under U.S. influence. And basically by doing so, he is saying that the protection of Iceland is essential to U.S. security. And he has to do this because the United States is still neutral and there's still a substantial isolationist movement
mm-hmm.
Within the United States. So everything that he's doing at this point, he has to clearly articulate what the security benefit is to the United States in order to prevent opposition from Congress to his actions. Okay.
Got it.
So shortly after he declared the Western Hemisphere, that Iceland was in the Western Hemisphere, he proposed to the British ambassador that the U.S. take over responsibility for Iceland's security. The British readily agreed. They had recently experienced setbacks in the Mediterranean, and the ability to transfer troops from duty in Iceland, would help them greatly. So the order comes in to the special observers, hey, plan for relief of British forces in Iceland, time now.
Mm-hmm.
So they quickly put together a reconnaissance party with some of the SPOB staff members. They went over to Iceland. While they were there, they gathered data on British and Icelandic infrastructure and Iceland's environmental conditions for each of their areas of expertise, right? So by what we call warfighting functions now.
Yep.
They identified constraints and limitations that a force that was stationed there would have to operate under. Then they sent their G4, a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel George W. Greiner, to Washington, D.C. with a report of the reconnaissance. And this report had annexes for, each of those, warfighting issues pertaining to warfighting functions that they had examined while they were there.
Yes.
So subsequently, American units that ended up executing the relief of British units in Iceland used this data to formulate their own plans. And this operation was called Operation Indigo.
And I guess later on in your dissertation, you talk about how this specific mission actually took place. U.S. actually sent troops to Iceland at some point,
Yes.
correct?
Yep. No, they started sending troops to Iceland in July of 1941. So the first force to go there were a group of Marines. They started actually building housing for the subsequent U.S. Army forces that arrived there, later throughout the year. So over the course of, from July 1941, where you get the first set of U.S. forces landing on Iceland, all the way through to 1942, they're executing this relief plan where you've got, as a U.S. unit arrives, a corresponding British unit then, leaves the island. So the idea is that, you're never going to weaken the defense of Iceland while this troop movement is going on.
Mm-hmm.
So they're essentially doing a relief in place with the British units as they go through. And part of what the special observers learned, in doing this analysis is, again, they're learning how the British are organized. They're learning the capabilities, the strengths, the weaknesses of British units, and they're learning how they kind of occupy their battle space and how to. This is the first instance where you have U.S. units, during the war, where you have U.S. units and British units, operating in close coordination.
So once they got back from Iceland, for basically the rest of 1941, there were a whole host of different planning efforts going on at the same time, whether working on the Rainbow Five, planning for basing and logistics, communications policy, medical planning, and whatnot. Out of all those things going on at the same time, I think the most fascinating thing I read in your dissertation was how the SPOBs got sucked into the Lend-Lease program. And can you talk a little bit about that and these secret trips to Russia that were made by some of the staff?
Yep. So the first trip they made to Russia was in July 1941 in response to Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union the previous month. So at this time, U.S. and British officials were trying to decide how much of and what type of aid to provide to the Soviet Union. Harry Hopkins, one of Roosevelt's principal agents, went to the UK to discuss with the British how U.S. aid policies should be changed in light of the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. While he was there, it was decided that he should go to Russia himself and assess the Soviets' prospects for survival. He was doing this because the U.S. and British governments didn't want to send equipment there merely to have it fall into the hands of Germany if the Soviet Union was defeated.
Because they were losing initially really bad the first couple months.
They were getting they were taking massive casualties. And they were having entire formations surrounded and captured by German forces. So to assist him, Hopkins in his analysis of the Soviet Union's military capabilities, Cheney sent his chief of staff, McNerney, with him. So while there, both he and Hopkins, looked at Soviet military capabilities. And, the Soviets were pretty secretive with McNerney. They kind of kept him on a short leash.
Mm-hmm.
But because of Hopkins' stature, he was able to get additional information out of the Russian defense establishment. And essentially, even with the limited information that McNerney was able to get a hold of, as well as the additional data provided by Hopkins, they both assessed that Russia, at the very least, was strong enough that it was not going to collapse in 1941. Therefore, in their opinions, it was worth sending them aid to keep them afloat, to help them fight the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first trip. So eventually, the Roosevelt and the Churchill government decide that they are going to send aid to the Soviet Union. So that spawns a second trip that takes place in September 1941. So prior to that trip, though, the U.S. and the British have to come to an agreement as to how much aid that was allocated to Britain is now going to go to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a discussion that takes place prior to that in London. So the SPOB staff participates in the Air Committee of those negotiations. And then General Cheney and his air officer Colonel Lyon, they traveled to Russia with the mission and served on the conference's air committee. And then while there, they, along with their British counterparts, negotiated a program for providing the Soviet Union with U.S.-built aircraft, mostly fighters and bombers.
So after the U.S. enters the war on December 7th, or the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, how did the SPOB's mission and plans start to change?
So before I can talk about how they changed, I need to briefly talk about the rest of the tasks that the U.S. Army had in Rainbow 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, one of the tasks was the relief of British forces in Iceland. They had 3 additional tasks. One was to, in cooperation with the Royal Air Force, conduct offensive and defensive air operations. The next task was to provide ground and air defense of U.S. naval installations in the U.K. So part of the Navy's side of the plan was to participate in convoy escorts and also conduct raids on enemy shipping. So they had agreed to provide the U.S. Navy with bases on British soil.
Okay.
And then the final task was to provide a token force for defense of the British Isles. So, and what's meant by the term token force is it was only a reinforced regiment of soldiers. But the idea was that the U.S. Army was going to help show solidarity with their British allies by putting troops on the ground fighting with them in the UK, right? That they weren't just going to provide ships and they weren't just going to provide aircraft. Okay. So, in planning for all these different tasks, they essentially have to plan for different task forces in different parts of England and Northern Ireland. So the naval-based portion of the task, that's going to take place in Northern Ireland and Scotland, because that's where the naval installations are projected that they're going to be. So they go out, they do recons of those areas, in a similar fashion to what they did in Iceland. They assess the infrastructure, they look at airfields, and then they develop a report of reconnaissance with a preliminary plan for protecting those naval installations.
Okay.
Same thing with the token force. That's going to be in southeast England, near the area where the channel has its narrowest part, near a town called Rotham. That's ultimately where they decide that the token force is going to be placed. And they decide to position this as a mobile reserve. So if the British defenses get attacked in that area, the British operational commander will have that U.S. reinforced regiment on reserve to allocate wherever he needs additional strength.
Okay.
And then the bombardment force, they start planning for that. And for that, they go to the eastern side of England in an area called Huntingdon. So there's a number of airfields that they survey there, and they select for the bombardment force. And then to support all of these different task force, they develop a what they call the base area. And this is basically all the logistics depots that they're going to use to support all these different task force that are throughout the British Isles. All right, so that's what they're assuming that they're going to have all these different task forces. Part of the process of planning for all these different task forces, they other issues arise that they figure out that they need to solve, like the communications policy, cooperation and air policy, legal jurisdiction for U.S. forces in the United Kingdom, as well as command relations between the different services and between U.S. and British forces. So those are all problems that they're working on prior to Pearl Harbor. Now, once you have Pearl Harbor, there's a change in the plan.
As always.
Yep. So how does it affect SPOBs? First and foremost, the status of the group changes. So it gets renamed to United States Army Forces in the British Isles, or USAFB for short. So now, instead of just being this planning group, the group is a full-fledged theater headquarters. All right. And Cheney is designated as the first commander for U.S. Army ground and air forces in the United Kingdom. The size of the ground force to be sent to the UK also increases dramatically, expanding from the one reinforced regiment that was identified for the token force to 3 infantry divisions and 1 armored division. The task for the ground force changes as well. Instead of reinforcing British forces in the southeast of England, they're now going to relieve British mobile forces in Northern Ireland. and help the British defend Northern Ireland against an attack by Axis forces. There's a number of reasons for why this change took place. As in Iceland, relieving British units in Northern Ireland would allow them to be used elsewhere. Additionally, Churchill and Roosevelt supported the change for political reasons. Both of them thought that sending a larger contingent of U.S. Troops to the U.K. would improve the morale of the British people. And they also thought that sending Americans to Northern Ireland would improve relations with the Irish Free State, which up to that point had remained neutral and offered only limited cooperation with the British in terms of security. So, yeah, there's significant changes already.
Yeah.
However, in spite of the dramatic changes to the plans for employment of U.S. Army ground forces, their pre-Pearl Harbor work proved essential to the success of the movement of the first U.S. combat units to the U.K. in an operation called Magnet. Planners back in the States used the data they had collected prior to Pearl Harbor to develop the operations plan for Magnet, referencing, in some cases, copying verbatim the information that SPOBs had in their preliminary plans, right? So
easy staff work.
That's right.
Copy what was done already.
Yep. They did what a good staff officer should do. First question they asked, has anybody already worked on some of this stuff, right? And then they went into the annexes, they looked at the plans that had been developed before, and they identified what they could use and what they had to change, right? So they were doing the World War II version of copy paste, for some of those annexes. So the staff at USAFB also contributed their expertise, right? So these guys have been in the UK planning for 7 months already. So they knew the British system, they knew the terrain, they had assessed facilities in the areas that they're sending these troops to. And as the headquarters for U.S. forces in Britain, it was now their responsibility to oversee the execution of Operation Magnet. So they're not just planning, they're executing an operation.
Mm-hmm.
And they used their pre-Pearl Harbor planning expertise and the relations they developed with the British defense establishment to great effect in getting these initial contingents to the UK.
Hey, Rick, do you remember what the first combat troops that came across were?
It was the 34th Infantry Division under Russell P. Hartle.
Yeah, and in one of your footnotes, I'm pathetic now. I read all the footnotes as I read through. I actually went and saw the YouTube video. There's the video of them coming across and coming ashore. It's amazing that actually exists and is up there for anyone to see.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of good footage on YouTube. You just have to be careful, when you're looking through stuff because there's a lot of bad stuff on there too. So, definitely recommend, if you find something that you try to research the context of the event.
Despite the important work that the SPOBs were accomplishing in England prior to Pearl Harbor and after, you mentioned there was always some sort of disconnect though between them and the establishment and the War Department and other agencies in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about this problem a little bit and how it intentionally or unintentionally undermined the observer mission?
Well, I'd like to say first that I don't really think any of it was intentional. What you have to understand is that while the special observers are over in the United Kingdom, there's significant turbulence in the War Department and in the Army in general back in the United States. So,
Mm-hmm.
It's their last major conflict was the First World War, and then after that, the Army shrank significantly,
Yes.
And now the Army is expanding to this great size again. Okay, so the War Department is coping with trying to figure out what the best way is to organize themselves. They're trying to figure out how to conduct major maneuvers with large formations using, conducting combined arms operations, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is stuff that they've thought about in the interwar period, but hadn't had the resources to execute to full effect. And then they're also going through administrative changes as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to figure out how best to reorganize the War Department itself to be more efficient, and so that guys like George C. Marshall can focus on what's really important. So they're dealing with that, and it looks to me that they're distracted by that, and as a result of it, communication between the special observers and folks back in the States, specifically the War Department and the War Plans Division, it's very lopsided.
Mhm.
Right. So the special observers are collecting all this data. They're developing all these preliminary plans. They're trying to make these agreements. They're sending all this data back. They're sending requests for information back to the United States. They're trying to get decisions on policy, but they're getting very little back from the states in terms of guidance. So part of that, I think, is this disorganization. The other part of the problem that I think is sort of hampering communication, or at least the ability to act on their requests, is the fact that, prior to the war, the United States is still neutral. So there's some things that the War Department can't commit to just because of U.S. neutrality, right?
Yes.
Now, because of these issues with communication and coordination, what ends up often happening, is that plans will change in the states. The special observers will keep planning on the guidance that they had when they first got there, and then often what would happen would be that they would be informed by their British counterparts eventually that things had changed, and then they would have to go back to the War Department and ask what was going on. Because if you remember what I said in the beginning, there was an exchange of military missions. So there's a British Joint Staff mission in the United States at the same time that is also conducting coordination with U.S. military officials. Okay. So sometimes things would be decided with that set of officers, right? And the information wouldn't get back to the special observers until it was way late.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons they were sort of behind all the changes all the time.
I guess, that caused a lot of friction, as like you were talking about, as the war progressed into the middle and latter part of 1942. I guess the biggest conflict you give a lot of attention to was between the chief of the Army Air Forces, General Hap Arnold, and the SPOBs in their process of establishing the 8th Air Force in England. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So specifically, the disagreement was over the organization of command for the U.S. Army Air Force in Britain. So Arnold wanted to establish an Air Force that was separate from the ground forces. So an independent Air Force, still under the theater commander, but separate from the ground force commander. Cheney argued that the forces in Rainbow Five, were organized into separate task forces, and they should each be allocated the required air assets, with the task force commander answering directly to the theater commander. So this debate, this dialogue and eventually disagreement over the organization of U.S. Air Forces in the United Kingdom, starts taking place in the summer and fall of 1941. And this discussion continues, really, it turns into an argument, and then really it goes on until May of 42. Okay, so it goes on for a while. Now, if you look at this issue from the perspective of executing the task force concept in Rainbow Five, Cheney's assessment is logical. Okay, these task forces were small in size. They were separated by great geographic distances, and most of them would be operating under some type of British operational control. So under these conditions, it would be essential that these task force commanders would have control of their own air assets, right? So that they could coordinate for the requirements of each of the individual task forces. However, plans had changed. Yeah. And this is one of the things that the special observers were behind on, right? They're not getting updated information on these changed plans rapidly from the War Department. So, we already saw a change in Operation Magnet. The Army Air Forces, began changing their plan for the air war in the latter part of 1941. Again, they're not communicating that effectively to SPOBs. And then you've got planners on the Army side in the War Department. They're already beginning to imagine to not imagine, to envision a force, a U.S. Army force in England substantially greater in size than what was originally called for in the Rainbow Five. Okay. So this information isn't getting communicated to Cheney. So Cheney's still thinking Rainbow Five. This is the appropriate way we should set up the Air Forces. And he begins not fighting at this point, but disagreeing with Arnold. Then Pearl Harbor happens. These changes start taking place. Eventually Cheney becomes aware that he needs to plan for a substantially bigger force. And at that point, Arnold is like, hey, you've seen that, we have a change in the force. There's going to be this really large Air Force. It's going to have an independent command to conduct, these extensive bomber operations against the continent. Cheney holds out for some reason, and I still haven't quite figured out why. My best interpretation is that he was really affected by his experience observing the Battle of Britain and then subsequently those test sector exercises that he conducted in the States. So, he's looking at this problem of the best way to set up the command, if you're going to defend Britain, which, his method would be best because they would integrate it much better into the British air defense system. Arnold is thinking more offensively, right? He's thinking about taking the fight to Germany, and his system is better for that, and it's better for the size of the ground force element that's going to be there as well. So ultimately, by May of 1942, Cheney finally figures this out and tells his staff to start planning along those lines for an independent Air Force. But prior to that, what was happening was Arnold was sending Air Force officers to establish the 8th Air Force, and he was telling them to establish it with his organization of command in mind, right? As an independent Air Force. Cheney's staff was trying to fulfill his vision by, setting up a command structure that would facilitate a task force concept. And that generated tremendous friction during that time period between when Pearl Harbor, happened and ultimately in May of 42, when Cheney realizes that he's got to go to Arnold's concept. Yeah. So that's the story of the conflict between Spobs and Arnold.
The Spobs mission in England, I guess, never technically stopped, but it kind of transitioned, as you kind of briefly mentioned early on, as the military buildup in England started in 42. Can you briefly talk about how the original observer group's involvement in the planning and coordination kind of came to an end, and as the European Theater of Operations, U.S. Army, was established?
Yes. So the group briefly transitioned into planning for Operation Bolero, which that's the code name for the buildup of U.S. forces in the UK, and Operation Roundup, which was an early version of what would become Operation Overlord. In June, the U.S. Army redesignated USA FBI as the European Theater of Operations United States Army, or ETUSA for short, and then subsequently replaced Cheney as commander with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower then replaced most of the staff with new people, although there were some that remained and continued to work with the British on Bolero and what would become Operation Overlord.
What's the current historiography say about what the Special Observers mission was and what they accomplished, and then kind of give what you argue to be their legacy based off your research?
Well, I don't think that my interpretation is substantially different from what many scholars have written about them. The issue with most of the prior work is that Spob's work has been inadequately analyzed, in my opinion, if you look at it, from in total, right? So although the special observers have appeared in a number of works pertaining to Anglo-American relations during the Second World War, I would say that most of the works have underestimated their role in laying the groundwork for Anglo-American coalition war in Europe. So you'll see the special observers' activities sprinkled throughout the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force official histories
Mm-hmm.
of the Second World War, as well as personal memoirs of officials living in Britain, and a small number of works about diplomatic history. In these works, the authors generally depict the special observers as minor supporting characters, or offer just enough information about the group's activities to serve as the backdrop for analysis of Dwight D. Eisenhower and what would become the supreme headquarters for the Allied Expeditionary Force,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, I mean, they're really overshadowed by who came after them. Now, there is a small body of literature, while not offering comprehensive analysis of the group's activities, that attempts to highlight the important role the group played in fostering Anglo-American cooperation. So I'll mention one by name. So when I set out to work on this study, the best functional analysis of the group's activities that I found was a book called The Origins of the Grand Alliance by William T. Johnson. So the additional title that comes after, The Origins of the Grand Alliance is Anglo-American Military Collaboration from the Panay Incident to Pearl Harbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Johnson's book is great. He did a lot of great analysis of the special observers' activities prior to Pearl Harbor, but his historical question was really more global in scope.
Okay.
And he really just didn't have a lot of opportunity to delve deep into SPOB's work after U.S. entry into the war, because his question specifically deals with the pre-war period.
Mm-hmm.
So he's missing about 6 months of their work in here. So my study expands on his analysis and looks at the group's work in total, from the beginning of its existence, from its dissolution. And I really think that my argument is that you need to do that in order to fully assess their significance.
Mm-hmm. Before we finish up, are there any other topics you want to bring up that we didn't cover or discuss?
So I will just mention, in closing, what I think the legacy of the group is, what their primary, if I had to sum up their primary contribution to the Second World War, I would go to a quote that Dwight Eisenhower has expressed, or had expressed on many occasions. And that's the idea that plans are nothing, but planning is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, just about any military operation, plans are going to change. You have to do some planning based on assumptions. Some of those assumptions are not going to pan out. That's something that we just take for granted as military professionals. Mm-hmm. So what is important, what Eisenhower said is important, is the act of planning, the act of engaging, with these theoretical problems is, or actual problems, as SPOBs did, is that they keep you steeped in the character of the problems that you may be called upon to solve in the future, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what SPOBs really did. With all this work that they did in Britain, 7 months prior to Pearl Harbor, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, they, through their work, kept both British officials and U.S. officials steeped in the character of the problems that they would one day be called upon to solve, right? Mm-hmm. And subsequently, their successors were able to take the work that they had done and, continue with it in terms of cooperating with the British in the European Union.
All right. And with that, I guess we'll finish it up. Lieutenant Colonel Rick Anderson, I appreciate you joining me for this talk, and good luck on your this upcoming academic year, and hope everyone and your students and your family stay safe over the next couple months.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk. Thanks.
Yeah. Good to talk to you, my friend. Talk to you soon.